This story is really personal to me, but I feel it's worth sharing, and I've somewhat healed from some of the trauma from that time. I knew when I started this channel I would share it someday. Please ignore the sound of breathing if it's louder than normal. I have pneumonia. As some of you know, my dad is an amputee. In the fall of 2019, he went in for a routine surgery to have his aortic arteries unclogged. The whole surgery was only supposed to last 2 hours, but after 11 hours and only minimum updates, we knew something was off. They finally closed him up and brought him to the ICU. My mom called me to tell me he was out of surgery finally, and they had found infection. They did most of what they went in there to do, and they would need to monitor him very closely overnight and give him tons of antibiotics through an IV. They were talking of more surgeries, but we had no idea what they meant. The next morning, I was woken up by a 7 a.m. call from my frantic mother. She was crying and said they wanted her to sign a form to have his leg amputated, otherwise he would die for sure. He had septic shock and he was going to die if we didn't consent to the surgery. Even with the surgery, we were facing only a 30% chance he would survive. Of course, faced with only minutes to make the decision, we signed that form. They rushed him back into the OR and amputated enough of his leg to remove all the infection and affected areas during that surgery. And at first, it looked as if he would just be a below-the-knee amputee, which is much easier to recover from and learn to use a prosthetic, because you still have your knee joint. But the infection had spread too far, and he wasn't getting better fast enough, so they had to make it an above the knee. Back into the OR he went, and back into intensive care. He was sedated and on a ventilator, so he had no idea what was going on. Those first few nights, 9 to be exact, were a nightmare, a blur, and the following paranormal experience happened on his second night in intensive care. My mom had finally fallen asleep for a few hours in our little room inside the hospital waiting room, and I couldn't get to sleep. So I put my shoes back on and went and sat in the folding chair next to my dad's bed. I put my hand on his and said, "You can't leave me, old man. I'm only 31, and you still have so much to teach me." I could have sworn he squeezed my hand, but it could have been my imagination. There was a nurse by his side 24/7 at that time. He was the sickest patient they had on the ward. The nurse said, "Keep talking to him, he hears you." So I said, "I know you want to see your mom again, but it's not time." Grandma had passed away a year prior, as well as 2 of his brothers. The nurse stepped out of the room to grab a few more bags of antibiotics and other meds that he was running out of. He had 19 medication bags attached to his IV pole at one point, so I couldn't tell you which exactly she went to get. "Grandma, if you hear me, send him back," I said. My hand still on his, I felt a squeeze. Not really a strong squeeze, just a few of his fingers lightly pressing on mine. I felt a presence in the room that wasn't there before. I know it sounds cliché, but I felt like I was being watched. I must have dozed off in the chair next to his bed, because the next thing I remember was his nurse tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Dear, go lay down and get a few hours of sleep. Nothing's gonna change in here." So I did. But again, the next night, I couldn't sleep. There had been small updates throughout the day. He wasn't even close to out of the woods yet. And there was no talk of being able to remove the ventilator and lift sedation to see what happened. He was just better enough for there not to be a nurse assigned to stay in his room, but there was one within feet of his door at any given time. Again, I grabbed the chair and sat next to him. This time, I felt like I was being watched and I couldn't shake it. About 10 minutes into me sitting there and chatting with Dad, I felt a chill and a pressure on my shoulder, as if someone had put their hand there. "Now I'm hallucinating," I said out loud. Figuring it was probably better to wrap this late night chat up, I saw my mom in the doorway. Can't sleep either? I asked. Nope, not a chance, she replied. I left her alone with him, thinking about how hard this had to be for her, watching the man she loved for over 30 years lay helpless on a ventilator. We had never had something like this happen to any of us. I had worked in a hospital before, so I was no stranger to the tubes and machines. But for my mom and sister, I knew it had to be even scarier than it was for me to see him this way. My dad is one of the toughest people I know, so seeing him so docile was concerning. I returned to our little room inside the ICU waiting room, where we had 2 oversized chairs with leg rests that Mom and I would call our bed for 9 nights. I closed the door and said, "Grandma, was that you? I feel you here with us." That's when I felt the sudden urge to pick up my phone and unlock it. I can't explain how strong the urge was, and I wasn't spending much time on my phone during that time. Only enough to keep my group of people updated on Dad's condition as it changed every minute. When I picked up the phone and unlocked it, it was open to a picture of myself, my grandma, and my mom, taken right before leaving my grandma's birthday party the year prior, just a few weeks before she passed. Looking back, I know that was her. You just had to be there to feel what I was feeling. She was in that ICU room with Mom and I, and she didn't leave Dad's side. I firmly believe she had a hand in sending him back to us, because the odds were stacked against him. Well, friends, I'm glad I made it through that story without blubbering like a baby. If you made it this far, my dad's alive and well, and my mom and I are his live-in caregivers. I do still believe that Grandma pushed him back to us. He told us weeks later, after he awoke and was able to talk and understand, that he didn't remember anything from being under, except he remembers seeing his mom and knowing something bad must have happened. Thank you so much for sticking with me on this one. It was actually therapeutic to share. If you've made it this far, drop a like on the video so I know you heard the full story. And with that, I'll see you tomorrow for a super special Halloween video. Bye, friends.